Welcome to the third in the League of Women Voters Morristown's area membership team outreach webinars. We are happy that you're able to join us. The Morristown Area League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that supports and informs voters on the local, county, and state levels. We are also active participants in our parent organization, the League of Women Voters of the United States, which represents us on the national and international levels. The Morristown Area League of Women Voters is the product of mergers of several local leagues over the past 20 years. Today, we represent Morristown, Morris Township, Morris Plains, Randolph, Madison, Chatham Township, and Chatham Borough. We also have members from other parts of Morris County without active local leagues. The League has been educating voters, advocating for the rights of voters, and empowering women and men through our support for fair and equitable policies for over 100 years. Rising out of the suffragist movement, we have carried our voices to the streets, to the halls of our legislative bodies, to government officials, into classrooms, civic organizations, and into a wide range of other public venues. We sponsor candidate forums, host voter registration drives, and work with a wide range of organizations to share information about the voting process and to educate voters. Earlier this year, we partnered with the Girl Scouts to bring a Voter Girl program to close to 500 Girl Scouts at 4 different locations around our state. We invite you to learn more about us and our activities on our website, the League of Women Voters morrisarea.org, and through our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. Our program this evening will focus on the importance of the census and how gathering an accurate counting of all residents impacts a wide range of equity and social justice issues. Our legislative districts are redrawn every decade based on the size and location of our population. The League is heavily invested in making certain our legislative districts are drawn in a fair and equitable way. But the census count goes far beyond how our legislative districts are drawn. Funding for many important government programs is also linked to the census. Our panel this evening will discuss how these numbers impact them and the work that they do. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, followed by a period of questions and answers. We would like you, the attendees, to also be part of the discussion. We invite you to write your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Judy Whoop, who is working this evening as our Q&A monitor, will read the questions, and I will direct the question to one of the panelists. At the end of the program, we also invite you to reflect on the program. Please write down one idea that you will take away from tonight's discussion and a suggestion on how we can improve the program. Our first panelist is Khyati Joshi, a professor in the education department at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Professor Joshi is a public intellectual whose social science research and community connections inform policymakers, educators, and everyday people about race, religion, and immigration in the 21st century America. Her most recent book is White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America, which was released in July of this year. For more information, please look at her website, KhyatiJoshi.com. Please welcome Khyati.
Thank you. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me. And I'm excited to be on a panel with Jakki and with Karol. The census is a big issue. The census has always been a big issue. And this year it became a political football when it didn't need to be. We need to have an accurate count. We will see what kind of count we end up with. It officially ended a few days ago. That date changed a lot, and it was a moving target for those of us who are doing this work on the ground. In Passaic County, I co-chaired the Complete Count Committee, and it was really difficult. Of course, everything was way more difficult because of COVID, but even if COVID had not been around, the fear that immigrant communities in particular had because of all the hoopla around, well, we might have the citizenship question. Hi there. We might have the citizenship question. We may not, you know, did put it out over there also. Hello there. It really created extra work for those of us getting people to fill out the census, you know, on the ground. Now, the census has been very important to me always as a researcher. I rely on the demographic data to talk to my students about our various communities, particularly immigrant communities. And I also use the census to explain to people how the term race is a social construct, because our census has changed every 10 years. Indeed, no two censi have been the same. If my family, and I think it's worth repeating here, how race is a social construct, not a biological construct, as a lot of people think, because they see, for everybody who's watching here, they see differences in how we look. And so it can be confusing. But the census has always changed. If my family had been here in the 1920s, I would have been classified as Hindu, Hindoo. In 1950, I would have become other. I became Asian in 1980. Now that sounds a little crazy. India has not moved. I'm from India. India is part of Asia, and there is plate tectonics, so we do get a little shift there, but overall we can say that India has not moved, right? And so again, showing that these categories are legal and social construction and very real, because there's tremendous impact of race on America. So getting a complete count, especially from our racial minority communities, is incredibly, incredibly critical. But what I was thinking about when you contacted me, Rosella, about this forum and talking about the census is that to me, census has always been a neutral issue. And it got me that it shouldn't be, it's not political. I never saw it as political, right? And it got me thinking about the work that the League of Women Voters does and how you all are nonpartisan. And I think that one of the really important things to bring together in that is that nonpartisan doesn't mean neutral, and nonpartisan shouldn't mean neutral. Completing the census, getting a complete count is a social responsibility we have. There are social and moral issues in our country today, voter suppression being another moral issue, where these issues, it's right and wrong. It's not about partisanship. And so I think that a lot of times people understand nonpartisan to be neutral, and neutral on social and moral issues equals silence. And we can't have that. So civic organizations like League of Women Voters, you know, you are focused on voting, and we have to look at the variety of ways that voter suppression happens. People kind of tend to think of it, well, before seeing all the long lines in Georgia and Texas, which is voter suppression. I mean, people on one level see it as, oh, there's excitement to go vote, but let's be clear, it's voter suppression. And, you know, but before that, we would think about voter suppression really happening maybe in Elizabeth, in Newark, in urban areas. I won't forget ever in 2008 here in Wayne, when local friends who are Indian American were going to vote. And we had done a lot of voter education specifically in the South Asian American community. And people knew that it was they were within their right to go into the voting booth with their grandmother and grandfather. And I had people calling me saying, Khyati, they won't let me in. They won't let me go in with my grandmother, because the poll workers were just saying, no, you can't do that. You know, and that's wrong. They can, right? So in suburbia, that's what voter suppression looks like. That's what voter suppression looks like, is misinformation. So I'll stop there, but really about thinking about nonpartisan is not neutral, and that nonpartisan groups need to have a voice on moral issues. Thanks.
Rosella, you're on mute.
Okay. Our next panelist is Karol Ruiz, who serves as the co-president of Wind of the Spirit Immigrant Resource Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit, faith-based organization that advocates for immigrant justice and human rights. She works as an assistant deputy public defender in the Mental Health Advocacy Division and serves on the Dover Board of Education, having won re-election for a second term in 2020. Congratulations, Karol. Let's welcome Karol Ruiz.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rosella. And thank you, League of Women Voters. It's an honor to share this panel and learn from Khyati, from Jakki, and contribute to, as what Khyati says, our moral responsibility to speak on issues, even as we maintain our nonpartisanship. Because, of course, I think to rephrase what Khyati was saying, nonpartisanship does not mean not political. I don't speak for the Board of Education. Today I am speaking on behalf of Wind of the Spirit. And we very much speak out about political issues because we believe it is our moral duty. And this summer we had duty called to support Black Lives Matter Morristown and co-organize a Black Lives Matter summer series of teach-ins and marches and protests and rallies to demand racial justice, to demand human rights. And I'm deeply grateful to the League of Women Voters for supporting that and joining that call. You volunteered in the heat, I think sometimes in the rain too, to register voters, which was part of our movement this summer. So thank you for that. I'll jump right into the census and kind of bring it back way to the beginning, just so we're all on the same page about what the census is. So the census has been conducted in our country every 10 years since 1790. And the purpose of the census is to readjust population figures across the country. I think that's the one purpose we all know and agree with. But the purpose is also to allocate resources accordingly. And that's the most important reason to conduct a complete, fair census, but sometimes the least known. It is also, the purpose is also to apportion and manipulate political power. We need to start with that hard truth that our country has used the census to manipulate political power always. From inception, African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person until 1865. And even though African Americans have contributed to quite literally and figuratively building this country since they were kidnapped and enslaved on this land in 1619, they were not named on the census until 1870. Is when African Americans were actually named on our census. Today, our current president is using the same playbook. So while maybe not denying the count to African Americans, the president has sought to deny the count to undocumented or unauthorized immigrants. That case is pending in our courts, and trying to dissuade immigrants from completing the census by trying to get a citizenship question on the census. He failed in that attempt, but is still trying. So manipulating power via the census is not an issue of the past, but it is an issue that harms Black communities and Brown communities disproportionately. COVID-19, the pandemic, has shined a spotlight on that harm. We saw a lack of resources in Black and Brown communities that led to our disproportionate deaths and illnesses. I'm from Dover, New Jersey, which is a majority Latinx community in Morris County, and our death rate rose because of the pandemic by 227%. It's the absolute highest death rate and contagion rate in Morris County, and one of the highest in the states, in our state of New Jersey. And of course, New Jersey was one of the first and worst hit of the states in the country. So we suffer more because of that when we have an inaccurate census count, because we don't have resources. There's nothing, as Professor Khyati explained, there's nothing biological about our race, right? There's nothing that makes me as a Latinx woman more susceptible to the COVID-19 virus. The reason we die at higher numbers and the reason we're getting sick at higher numbers are all those societal factors, all those lack of resources, a inaccessibility to fair and affordable housing. A lot of us are forced, because of high rents and denial of rental assistance program based on immigrant status, forced to live in extended family groups or even with strangers in one household. So of course, the more people in your house, the more likely that you could be exposed to COVID. Our hospital, St. Clair's Hospital, knew before even we had peaked, they knew in February, they knew they would not have enough beds, enough ventilators, enough capacity to meet the need in Dover. So Dover, in addition to being a majority Latinx community, is also a majority Democrat community. And the census really, this idea of political manipulation through the census really hit us hard back in 2011, after the 2010 census. We were redistricted out of NJ11 with our neighbor Morristown, which is a diverse community, perhaps more similar to Dover, into NJ7, with which is a community that's more white, that's more rural, and that's more Republican. And this was a result of that political manipulation. In 2010, the governor was a Republican, and the redistricting is always done and manipulated to benefit the government, the party in power. So redistricting process is always a contentious fight. In 2000, New Jersey 7, after that census, was redistricted. And in 2000, the Republicans and the Democrats agreed to trade off seats in NJ7 and NJ12 to secure the incumbent seat, not to secure representation of communities of color, not to secure resources, not because the shape might look less gerrymandered, but to secure incumbent seats. So the census is very important, and we cannot trust elected officials to redistrict us based on an accurate count, because they're redistricting based on the safety of an incumbent seat. So in addition to an accurate count, we also need independent commissions to apportion fairly, to do that redistricting fairly and take out the manipulation that has historically been part of the census. We also, in talking about the redistricting, it's important for folks to know that the redistricting in New Jersey is done every 10 years after the census, currently by a commission that includes 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 1, in this case, we have a Rutgers professor currently on, 1 person that's believed to be or intended to be a tiebreaker. But even that is interesting, given that New Jersey is a Democrat state with a Democrat governor, with Democrats in power in both houses, and Republicans are a very small minority in New Jersey, but they have this disproportionate power in terms of redistricting, right? You know, they've got 5 on that commission. So it sounds fair, right? 5 and 5, totally fair. That's the difference between equity and equality and representation. They are not represented on redistricting commission based on their presence in our state. So in order to claim that political power, yes, in order to claim that political power and access the resources that we need, Wind of the Spirit, despite the pandemic, we went out in person in the height of the pandemic to ensure that our communities were completing the census. And that was a big feat, as Professor Khyati mentioned, because many communities, immigrant communities, are afraid of deportation. Will the census lead to that? They think, am I allowed to, you know, I'm not a US citizen, I can't do it. President Trump was successful in instilling that fear in others. And then others are like, oh, well, what's the point? And what really hit home for people is informing them, see how we're dying. We don't have access to enough hospitals. See how our kids are not getting adequate education. They don't have the tablets and the internet to do remote learning. That's all tied to the census. And that, when you can tie it to the individual and what does this mean for you, that's how we were able to get, I personally contributed to reaching out to over 1,000 households to get the census done. It was a huge project. And right now, Dover's self-response to the census is 70.6, despite the pandemic. That's an amazing number, but it was 71.9 in 2010. So it isn't complete. We didn't have enough time or resources to get that done.
Thank you very much, Karol. I'm going to move on to our third speaker right now, who is Jakki Cobb. And Jakki is a wife and mother of 3 daughters, and she is Mimi to 1 granddaughter. Born and raised in Morristown, Jakki and her family moved to Landing 15 years ago. Jakki serves as the executive secretary for the Morris County NAACP, is an active member in the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and is an active member of the Morristown Area League of Women Voters. She reminds us, as Gandhi advises, that we have to be the change we want to see. Let's welcome Jakki Cobb.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm so delighted to be here and to share on the panel with these phenomenal women, Khyati and Karol and Judith and Rosella. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. And I'm coming as just a concerned citizen. I kind of call myself a serial volunteer right now in my life. I'm part of the NAACP. I serve as the secretary as of now. I'm also a member of the Coret's organization. I serve as the treasurer there, Delta Sigma Theta, and the League of Women Voters. And I enjoy this time in my life to be able to volunteer in these different organizations. And in terms of my time and when I came to the League of Women Voters, I would say that I would have to attribute that to Barbara, because our organizations collaborated and did a voter education forum, and Barbara was phenomenal in giving the education on how to fill out the ballot, the importance of it, how to, just pay attention to everything. And just because of her presentation is what really made me decide to want to be a part of the League of Women Voters. And so that was how I came to the League. And I'm just excited to be a part of the panel and look forward to the discussion going forward.
Let's go then, Judy. Unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So nice to hear all of you. You have so much information, so important, and I really want to thank you all for coming, taking your time out and sharing it with us. The first question is, do you think enough time was given for a fair and accurate census count to be gathered?
So we're going to ask each of the panelists to answer this question. I'm going to go in the same order that you spoke. So I'm going to start out with Khyati.
They kept moving the target, right? And we should have had at least another month. And they shouldn't have cut it, on the spur of the moment is what it really felt like. When you're really trying to get to communities that are, getting to people and families that are really like in the crevices of society, because that's how that's how we would have gotten the count to increase. So we should have had longer.
And Karol, the same question.
Of course not. And that was by design. We can't have a fair and accurate count during a pandemic with this limited time. And we as a government our government administration actively worked against it. You know, we talked about that same old playbook to suppress the political power of Black communities, of brown communities, of poor communities. And that was upgraded this year with the census, when the emphasis was placed on that self-response, right? Less enumerators, and then the inability for the enumerators to really get out and knock on doors because of a pandemic. So what happens to families without devices, families without internet? What happens to elders who may not be as savvy with the use of devices and the internet, even if they do have them? So this was purposeful, and the digital divide really, that with the pandemic was just the perfect storm to get an undercount. And that's the less people that are counted, the less money the government has to give back to us. And it's not, you know, we pay taxes. All of us pay taxes in one way or another, whether you're a homeowner or not, whether you're employed on the books or off. At some point, you're paying taxes. So these are resources that the government owes to us, and they can save that money by not counting us.
And actually, can I add something to that? I think it's important. You know, Karol has raised the issue on how the federal government, and specifically our president, really got in the way and wanted to get in the way, and is very intentional about trying to make sure certain communities aren't counted. And I think it's important that we also know that at the local level, there were government officials who wouldn't engage and didn't engage. And, you know, we got to kind of say it like it is. So I know folks in Morris County were trying to really getting what they could get going as a complete count committee and getting the resources from the state and working. But you have entire communities like Parsippany that were hardly touched. Because local officials weren't doing very much. You know, I'm completely biased, but here in Passaic County, we had local officials who were out there doing things and engaged and making sure the state resources that were allocated were getting here and were getting used the way we could. You know, so that was really frustrating. For me, that was really frustrating to see, because although in my county, it was being done well and being done right, and so many communities were being touched. But as an Indian American, I was very upset and frustrated to see what was happening and not happening in the Parsippany area. You know, so I think it's really important that it's not just federal, but that there's issues at the local level. And I think the attention was brought to the freeholders in Morris County, and didn't care.
Professor Khyati is from out of county, so she's allowed to say stuff like that. Never anything about our local elected officials.
So I'm going to move to Jakki and ask you to answer the same question. Do you think there was enough time for a fair and accurate census count?
No, I can't dispute Khyati or Karol. I don't think there was enough time. Not that I'm an expert in these areas as they, you know, seem to be, but I know just in my own personal experience and, you know, talking to some of my girlfriends, you know, I had a couple of girlfriends who they had in my opinion, flawed view of the census, and they were reluctant to participate in it. And I really was encouraging them. I'm like, it only takes 10 minutes. You know, it's not a lot of information. They're not tracking you. There's nothing that's going to come upon you as a result of taking the census. It's very important for you to do it so that our communities can get the resources that it needs. But there was a reluctance there. And I just wonder, where does that disinformation come from, where some people are really fearful of giving that information and not knowing the benefit that it's going to provide to their community, to their school, to the parks and recreation, and, you know, everything in their area that they would directly benefit from, but feel like, no, I can't do it. It's just like some people who feel like, young African Americans in some cases who are saying, no, it doesn't make any sense for me to vote. It's not worth it. It's not going to change anything. And I'm just like, that makes my head explode, because I'm saying, if you see what they're spending to stop you from voting and to suppress your vote, and you're going to still say that it's not worth it, you're missing the whole point of it all. So I'm curious to ask even Khyati or Karol if they know some of the origins of the misinformation that communities of color get when it comes to the census that makes them reluctant to even fill it out.
Well, some of it is, it does depend on the community. In some cases, those who've come here from war-torn countries and where governments were totalitarian and fascist. I say that because you all know what is going on in our country right now. There was fear, right? And that's why Jakki, what you did and the way you responded to your girlfriend is exactly what needed to happen. It's why here in Passaic County, we put out census videos in 5 languages, in the 5 most spoken languages in Passaic County: English, Spanish, Bengali, Arabic, and Gujarati. Okay, because folks need to hear it from them. Folks need to hear it in the language and the words they're used to hearing it. That helps. You saying it to your African-American girlfriends is really important. They're going to hear it differently than it coming from me or Karol or Rosella, right? So those are important. I'd have to look in. Karol might know the historical places, but it also, the historical pieces as to why the fear is there. But it's overall fear. The fear has come from the mistrust of the government because of what the government has done. Everything from poll taxes and literacy trust to sending back immigrants, in terms of Operation Wetback, in terms of what happened to immigrants who came here in the mid-20th century. So that's why the mistrust is there. And that's why I'm not given this, right? Because even if folks are citizens, there was still fear, right? Because I don't want anybody knowing my business. I don't need them here. So it's that bit of it, right?
So we need to move on to the next question because we have quite a few others. Yes.
What are some of the government programs that you work with that are impacted by the census count? And I think that was directed to Karol.
Yeah, so Karol, you've already given us a few examples with COVID with that. So if there are any others beyond that you can address?
I think the schools are the most important, and Zufall Health Center, and to just tie it into Jakki's question, the African-American community, you don't have to go back to slavery. You can go back to the civil rights movement. You can go back to Jim Crow, where property was taken, right? In Newark, people's homes were taken to build the highways. African-American communities have not been given any reason to trust our government. So when we would encounter that same response from our African-American residents here in Dover, we would bring it back to the schools. And it was almost a sacrifice. I know that giving this information, I've got this fear, I've got history to tell me I'm not to trust, but I care more about the health of my neighbors and more about the education of my children. And that's why I'm going to fill out the census. When you talk to them about the hospitals, the roads, I live on a county road where we've had so many accidents, and it's that's how we're going to get this fixed is completing the census and getting that funding. So it touches every aspect of our lives and every agency fathomable in our state.
Thank you.
You're muted, Judy. That, by the way, is the quote of 2020. You're muted.
Yes. Teaching about the African-American experience has been a state mandate in our K-16 schools for over 18 years. How successful do you think that effort has been? That's addressed to Jakki.
Thank you, Judy, for that question, Judith. I believe your question is referring to the Amistad Law that was passed in 2002. This is 2020. Me, again, speaking as just an individual, a concerned citizen who just happens to volunteer in a few civic organizations. I have to say, in my experience, I have 3 daughters. The oldest is 31, the youngest is 16. My youngest daughter goes to Pope John in Sparta, New Jersey. And to think that the Amistad curriculum, I don't know if it applies to private schools or not, but that the Amistad curriculum or the notion of that is anywhere in her curriculum, it's not the case. And then my older girls who graduated from Roxbury High School, first they were in school, in elementary school in Wharton, New Jersey. I was born and raised in Morristown. That's where I graduated from. And I can't say that I had a significant African-American history in my curriculum. That was prior to 2002, but my children going through Roxbury High School both have experienced bias incidents in their lives, which was unfortunate. And I can say that I think my youngest daughter, where I think they were attempting to do something that would qualify as, getting in line with the Amistad curriculum, is when they took the students to see Hidden Figures. And when was that? Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I can see that as an attempt, but overall, I would say in my experience, I don't see it. As part of the Morris County branch of the NAACP, we reached out to all of the counties in Morris County, the Morris school districts, all of the school districts in Morris County, let me get that straight, to just engage with us in a dialogue about where they are in that process. And only 2 districts responded and participated with us. Everybody else did not even respond to our email, did not respond to our inquiry or anything. And we've done follow-up and we've just not gotten any real engagement on the topic. And of course, everybody's excuse is what's going on with regard to the pandemic, but 18 years after a law has passed, you're always going to come up with something not to do it. And I think it's unfortunate. It's a disservice to all of our students, because my position is that we all bear the weight and the burden and the oppression of white supremacy and racism, right? We weren't slaveholders. We didn't go to Africa and kidnap anybody. We didn't enslave anybody, but we bear the weight of that from the narratives that we've all lived through in this country, from the things that are traditional, some of the ideas and the notions that are put forth that we all just accept as normal. And that's a weight that we all bear, that we have to engage and try to dismantle for the sake of our children and our grandchildren that are coming behind us, right? Because Khyati, she said in her opening statements, the construction of race. There's no white race, there's no Black race. We're all the human race, right? That I might just be I'm from North Jersey, somebody else is from South Jersey, you're from Italy, you're from Paris, you're from wherever, but we're the human race. And there's no hierarchy, but the construction of race has built in a hierarchy that we all have taken in. Even subliminally, we have this hierarchy in our mind that we've just been socialized with. And I think if the Amistad Law is fully implemented to show that people of color have contributed in every aspect of human life, science, music, literacy, athletics, business, everywhere, then these notions of a hierarchy can be dismantled and we can see each other for the the human beings that we are and the shared life experiences that we have. And we can respect and appreciate one another. You know what I mean? I say to my kids and I say to my children, I try to take off these traditions that I was brought up in. Everybody in my family has been a preacher. That's been from my great-great-grandfather on down. I too am a licensed minister, but I've had revelation and I have other opinions about some of that stuff. But I tell my children, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, you can believe whatever you want. As long as your belief system doesn't tell you to kill me or take my stuff, we're good. We're good. I don't care who you love. I don't care what you do. As long as your belief system says, love everybody around you, don't kill me, and don't take my stuff, do whatever you want. You're not hurting me because it's your own business. I don't care, really. You know what I mean? I don't care. As long as you're not trying to hurt me or my family or take my stuff, I don't care because I'm not going to take your stuff and I'm not going to hurt you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Jakki. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jakki. That was personal perspective that I don't think anybody missed. So thank you for sharing that. This past summer, many of our communities experienced teach-ins organized by Black Lives Matter, Morristown, and Wind of the Spirit. Why did you participate in those teach-ins? And do you think they were successful? That's for Karol.
Thank you. I just want to make sure we all heard that call to action, because what I heard Jakki say was that the NAACP reached out to Board of Eds and they didn't respond back. So we all need to contact our own Board of Education and ask, did the NAACP email you about the Amistad Act? Did you respond? Do you have it implemented? What do you plan to strengthen it and go from implementation to excellence? You know, this is not just a 1 month, oh, we complied with the law, check mark. So thank you for that call to action, Jakki. I definitely will get on that. And the teach-ins were part of that. They were one component of our summer series with Black Lives Matter in Morristown. We also had protests, we had rallies, we had the teach-ins, and we had demonstrations where we went together to boards of education to demand a curriculum that really focused on anti-racism, that focused on what Jakki already spoke on, ensuring that we knew the full history of African Americans in this country, and that we know about our history as a country that enslaved human beings, and a country that has been complicit and actively imperialistic and colonizing and guilty of genocide. And this is something that we can look to other countries. We can look to Germany, we can look to South Africa, we can look to Colombia, which is the country that I am from, to really come to terms with the harm that we have caused. The United States has never done that. We have never collectively, still to this day, even admitted, let alone atoned for, our sins of slavery and Jim Crow. And that was one of the goals of the summer series. And the reason that Wind of the Spirit participated and co-organized is that it is our duty. It is our duty, whether you are talking at home with your brother who has some racist ideology, or whether you need to look into yourself and take that Harvard implicit bias test and figure out, what is it that you're doing? And it can be embarrassing or shameful to admit that if you're in the elevator with a Black man, you might clutch your purse a little harder, or you might cross the street if you see a Mexican day laborer and you're afraid he's going to catcall you. Let's just start to learn it. Start to explore it. You know, forget the I'm not racist, my neighbor's Black. I'm not racist, my child is Black. No, just because your child or your neighbor or your spouse or whatever may be of a different race than you doesn't mean that you don't still have some of those inherent biases. And we've got to know them in ourselves, confront them with our families, reach out to boards of education and town councils and commissioners and legislators, and really have these conversations with our neighbors. And if racism makes you angry, you have a right to be angry. Don't expect that the conversation is always going to be like a moderated panel. Sometimes those conversations are going to be angry, right? Lynching people creates a generational trauma and fear and distrust and anger that we've just got to cope with. And that was one of the purposes of the Black Lives Matter movement in Morris County this summer. And we talked about, or we had our actions in over, I think, 11 municipalities. We talked about the facts that in Morris County, and this is a fact, a Black man is 22 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man. And the population of Black folk in Morris County is like 3%. So what you know, we've got to name that, and we've got to act on it. And while the former Morris County prosecutor resigned, and explained it had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter Morristown or Wind of the Spirit or NJ United, it happened, right? And while we're not yet there with the Amistad Act, every single or almost every single Board of Education in New Jersey is having conversations about Amistad Act, about anti-racism, about diversifying their staff and their administrators. So, you know, we can't talk about a social justice movement as a success, right? Was the civil rights movement a success because Obama was elected president, the first Black man president in this country out of, you know, 42 or 45 presidents? We had one. Is that a success? It's ongoing, you know, and is it a failure that the civil rights movement happened and New Jersey is still one of the most segregated school systems in the country? Maybe, but it's ongoing, right? We've got to keep at that, and that's why Wind of the Spirit was so committed during a pandemic with this. And we maintained our 6 feet of solidarity. We maintained our masks. To our knowledge, no one fell ill as a result of the teach-in or the march or the protest, and the work continues. And I appreciate all of you in partnership, the NAACP, our friends and neighbors in Passaic County, and the League of Women Voters.
Well, the other part of this question was, how do you think our communities can build on the summit's momentum? But you just answered that in your whole statement. So this is just from me, a question. Have you worked on encouraging people to run for Board of Ed or to run for public municipal offices? You know, to make the changes there where it counts at local levels. So can you answer that?
Yeah, 3 members of the organizing team of the Black Lives Matter Morristown and Wind of the Spirit Summer Series are running for Board of Education. There's a candidate, Natavia Hayes, it's an African-American woman from Boonton, Faith Alcantara, African-American woman from Florham Park, and Oliver Starnes from Morristown, and many more still continuing the work of advocacy. So certainly back to that, you know, taking back political power, that was certainly a delicious fruit of this summer's work.
Thank you. The next question, there has been a major push to translate more official communications from governments and schools into Spanish. Is language a barrier for any other immigrant communities? And how can we address overcoming those limitations? That's for you, Khyati. Unmute.
Yes, I mean, language is a barrier, you know, for anyone for whom English is not fluent, for who has not been educated in English and then trying to make a life here and get by day to day. And certainly for our children and our students in schools, especially when those students are sometimes confronted with punitive measures for speaking their language in the hallway, during lunch,
Yes.
On the playground. You know, that's an equity issue. That's an equity issue, and that's part of the anti-racist, anti-bias education piece. So it's there, and you know, it's not, you know, it's surprising to people, but bilingual education in this country came about because of a United States Supreme Court case in 1972, Lau versus Nichols, which was brought about by 5 or 7, I can't remember now, Chinese families. You know, bilingual education, ELL students, it's thought of as like a Hispanic issue, right? That because we're talking about Spanish. Well, no, actually, there's so many other languages, you know, and that also, you know, where we have students who speak a variety of different languages, who are English language learners. And I think that's important to think about, just like immigration often gets pegged as a Hispanic issue. Well, it's not only that, right? And we need to understand that. I'd like to also take a moment to comment on the Amistad piece. As somebody who does anti-racist training with teachers and administrators and works with boards, you know, I think it's really important to understand that we can have the Amistad curricula, we have really great curricula out there, but the problem is when teachers and administrators don't want to use it. And why don't they want to use it? Because they're uncomfortable, right? For those of you who might be interested, Teaching Tolerance put out a report, I want to say two years ago, and it's called Teaching Hard History, in which they interviewed and collected data from teachers who were saying they were teaching about slavery and Jim Crow. And the qualitative data shows that teachers were straight up and saying, you know, I don't want the white kids to feel bad, you know, and I don't want them to go home and feel guilty and things like this. And this is why it doesn't get taught. And so what we have to do is get, you know, as Jakki and Karol were talking about, we've got to get teachers and administrators, what I'm always saying to them is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because these issues, if you are dealing authentically and effective and you're being effective, you're not really comfortable, you know, and we can't wait till you get comfortable. We have kids dying because people are waiting to get comfortable to deal with these issues. So I do think that that's an important piece and something that's happening today. Why does it have to be so confrontational? Why do people have to protest like this? You know, why does it have to, you know, there has to be a better way to go about it. And I want to say that politeness is an issue. And we can talk about it in terms of protest, but we can also talk about it within meetings and organizations where politeness is a form of policing the dialogue and a way of silencing, because those of us who speak up are then not seen as polite, and therefore then we don't belong, right? And that happens in schools also. So I think the piece, you know, sometimes I'm called by a district, oh, we want to work on the curriculum. And I'm like, I'm not your person then. Before we get to curriculum, we have to deal with your biases and privileges and understanding what they are and how they affect students. So that's where we've got to start.
So
can I just say something? Oh.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a chance in just a minute. I'm going to ask you each now to give a summary statement. So we're going to start with Jakki, and you can respond to what's been said and then give us a summary statement of about no more than 2 minutes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say, last night I participated on a Zoom. This is the era of Zooms. We're all in Zooms like 6 times a day, each of us. And it was a conversation about race with Yolani Cobb. And one of the things that I took away from that conversation was, when it comes to education, right now, our history that the children are given, it's like a highlight reel. And it gives all the highlights, but it doesn't give the full game tape. And he made the analogy of an athlete. An athlete, you're never going to perform better or do better if you only look at your highlight reel. You have to look at the full game tape, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to learn from it in order to do better. That's right. And, you know, I think that's what we're sort of getting at here. With some of the things that we're talking about, that we need to stress the importance of a truth-telling time. you know, like you saw in South Africa where they had the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. We need that. We need to hear that. And I even thought, and it might sound outrageous, I said, white people should feel like they should be able to sue the government for what the government has put on them, right? Who has caused some white people to hold racist views to think that it's normal. This is normal. This is what has passed down through my family generation. Why are you villainizing me for these thoughts? And this is what has been the American tradition. And you have people who feel so guilty for what they believe, but they're saying, this is what I've been taught. And there's really no, you know, some people, yes, there's malice, but others, it's just what has been given to them. And not in their mind to come against anybody, but just what has been handed down. And so we have to look at that. And if we can be honest about those things, all of us hold biased views. All of us, every last one of us, Black people against Black people, Blacks against Latinos, Blacks against whites, whites against Blacks, everybody against every group, because that's just how this country is. And we just need to, you know, go in another direction. And I just appreciate this conversation, and I thank you guys for this opportunity. And Khyati, I want to know the name of your book. I want to get it, and I want to follow you. And the same thing with you, Karol. I really, really appreciate and respect you. Okay, thank you. I will definitely grab that one for sure.
Okay, Karol, please.
Yes, White Christian Privilege by Professor Khyati Joshi. Is that the correct pronunciation of your surname? Oh, it's definitely on my reading.
Yeah, you got it. And I just put in the website, so y'all can cut and paste it.
So reading, right? If we're going to start with self-education, reading is not it. Don't think you're going to read the, you know, so you think you want to talk about race and suddenly it's done. But it is one component. So I would add to that, if you can see it, A Black Women's History of the United States. And this is by Dana Ramey Berry and Colleen Nicole Gross. Colleen Nicole Gross is one of our Jersey owns as well. A Black Women's History of the United States will tell you a little bit about that the redistricting and the census and the way that this political power manipulation has been steeped in throughout, and encouraging the boards of education to implement that. So, you know, if we're going to summarize around the census is, you know, educate yourself with books like the ones we've mentioned. I would also add The Color of Law, The Price of Paradise. These are books that talk about how racism is inherent in our laws, like the way that we do our census. And The Price of Paradise talks about zoning, and New Jersey has some of the most racist zoning and segregated communities in the country. And again, that's resources. White, wealthy, fully counted communities have more resources, get less sick during the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. Then I would recommend documentaries. One I recently watched was Crip Camp, and it's on Netflix. Most people have Netflix now. Crip Camp is about the movement for disability rights, for 504 and the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. And that kind of just speaks to being a full person and being counted not just as 3/5 of a person, but a full person. And one of the most fascinating things, going back to this policing and politeness and the way we teach African-American history, we teach Dr. Martin Luther King as the good and the nice, and Malcolm X as the bad and the angry. Well, it was the Black Panthers, right? These Black folk with guns demanding the right. It was the Black Panthers who fed and supported the people with disabilities who were doing sit-ins for the 504 and the ADA, working together, right? And we've taught this history, like, oh no, don't mess with people like Malcolm X or the Black Panthers. In the civil rights movement, they were, you know, completely together with the majority white folk that were leading the the disability rights movement. And the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, if you look at the civil rights movement and what brought us its victories and where we failed, the same things are happening now, right? You know, Jakki talked about us all having biases and all of us having conflict. And yes, you know, it was the same argument with white women that that kept back the feminist movement in the civil rights era. We're having that same fight now,
Yes.
right? Those same struggles that our forefathers and foremothers experienced then, we are experiencing now. So, you know, even if you're just limiting to the lens through the census, you know, really study that and study that history and be uncomfortable and allow for anger so that we can get through those. Because when we cut each other off, the movement gets cut off. And I don't want our daughters to be having the same conversation 50 years from now.
You are so right. Okay, and so turn the last couple of minutes to Professor Joshi.
Thank you. And, you know, so we've, Jakki talked about kind of individual bias, and Karol and all of us have talked about institutional racism, systemic racism. And I'd like to end with actually talking a little bit about privilege, because it is a word that most people have a very negative, visceral reaction to. And if we're talking about white privilege, people have white folks have a really negative reaction to that. And I think it's really important to understand that privilege is a product of systemic racism, right? Whiteness is baked into our laws, right? Our laws are not race neutral. They are not gender neutral. And my book focuses on race and religion. They are not religion neutral. White folks have had an advantage from the get-go, all right? If we're talking about the United States right now. And it's important to understand that. So this is about, individual bias, but then it's about whose biases are reinforced by policy. So yes, everybody has bias. I have it, all 6 of us here have it, right? But then whose biases are reinforced by Supreme Court decisions, by laws that are passed at the federal, state, and local levels. And privilege is a product, white privilege is a product of systemic racism. And I think that explaining that, understanding that is helpful, because otherwise it's like, no, you're taking away that I've worked really hard to get here. No, I'm not. I'm just saying some things were a little easier for you. Some obstacles weren't in your way that were, if we're talking about white privilege, that were in the way of folks of color. And those obstacles are part of, what has, they're part of society because they're part of our laws and our public policies. And that connection has to be made because otherwise white privilege is just seen as an attack on somebody. If you're white, you didn't do a darn thing to get this privilege. You didn't do a darn thing to have it, except for be born in a white body that's classified as white in the United States and benefits from this, from what has happened and transpired in the past. So I think that is really, really important. And when people can take a breath, not feel like they're being attacked, and that is important. But what is also important is people being able to have forums, white folks having places to go and talk about what's going on, because that's what happens in classrooms, at the undergraduate and graduate level. That is what happens in workshops. And we can't tell people what to think. We have to, people have to kind of have a chance to process and engage and
evolve.
But we can't take forever because we got people dying while other people are getting comfortable. So that's a really important tension, and we got to keep pressing. So thank you, League of Women Voters, for putting this panel together. I think we could talk for hours.
I think so too, but I think you're absolutely right that one of the things the League can do is provide forums as we have this evening. And so I thank all 3 of you for such wonderful, enlightened discussion. And I think there's much more that we can talk about, and we'll have to look at putting that together. just a reminder that we'd also like our attendees to take a minute to put an entry in our Q&A, telling us first an idea that you're going to take away from this presentation, and secondly, any suggestions you might have to offer on how to improve our presentations. And I'd like to also inform you that unfortunately the final webinar in our series that was scheduled for Friday, October 30th at 11 a.m. will not occur due to some timing conflicts. We did not anticipate that so many people would have already voted at this point in time, and that's a good thing. But we invite you to check our website to view the other webinars in the series and to find future information on other membership outreach activities. So thank you everyone for such a wonderful and enlightening evening. And we'd like to say thank you particularly to Judy Whoop, who handled our questions and answers, and to Barbara Cooper-Smith, who handled the technical, all the technical issues tonight. So thank you very much to everyone, and good night.